Russia. The regime's top diplomat flies there next week. Plus, Russia calls for a UN Security Council meeting over Britain's decision to blame it for the nerve agent attack on a former Russian spy and his daughter. So the countdown to the Inter-Korean summit is on, with just over 3 weeks to go until President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un meet face-to-face at the border. Working-level officials from the two sides have gathered in Panmunjom to hammer out arrangements for the summit on April 27th. We now cross over to Seoul's Unification Ministry, where our correspondent Oh Jung-hee is standing by. So Jung-hee, give us the details.
Mark, South and North Korea are meeting once again at the truce village of Panmunjom to iron out the details for protocol, security, and press coverage of the Seoul-Pyongyang summit talks slated for April 27th. It's been reported that today's talks would begin at 10 a.m. South Korea time, so we expect that the delegations from Seoul and Pyongyang could be meeting and greeting with each other now as we speak. South Korea is sending a 7-member delegation led by Cho Han-gi, a presidential secretary on protocol. The delegation includes a senior presidential security officer and the director of Cheongwade's press center. The talks will be taking place at the Peace House located in the South Korean side of Panmunjom, the same place where the summit will be held. The talks were originally planned to take place on Wednesday, but on Tuesday night, Pyongyang asked for a one-day delay. The North also suggested the two Koreas hold working-level talks on communication this Saturday, and Seoul accepted both proposals. The talks on communication will most likely deal with establishing a hotline for the leaders of South and North Korea to communicate directly with each other.
And Jung-hee, if you wouldn't mind, just walk us through exactly what is on the table today.
Well, actually, the items on the agenda for today's talks aren't clearly known, but we are expecting that the route North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will take to the Peace House on the day of the summit could be decided. He now has two options. He could either walk across the land border or get to the location by car. But to add some drama to the occasion, he could choose to cross the land border on foot. The officials from Seoul and Pyongyang could also discuss specific schedules for the summit talks, size of entourage for both leaders, and whether to broadcast the April 27th summit live. How the two leaders will have lunch and dinner and whether their wives will accompany the leaders to the summit are also expected to be discussed. That's all I have for now, and I'll get back to you with more updates for a later newscast. Mark.
Well, thank you very much to our Oh Jung-hee there at the Unification Ministry in Seoul. Now, stating that South Korea and the United States continue to share the common goal of the complete denuclearization of North Korea, Seoul's top diplomat has emphasized a certain degree of flexibility will be necessary going forward. Kang Kyung-hwa says the allies are still trying to figure out how far the regime is willing to go. Kwon Jang-oh with the details.
South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa stressed that flexibility will be required to have a frank and comprehensive discussion with North Korea during the upcoming Inter-Korean and Pyongyang-Washington summits. Speaking to reporters on Wednesday, however, Kang explained denuclearization remains the primary objective.
We are making preparations to make the denuclearization of North Korea an important topic at the South North Korea summit and the North Korea-U.S. summit. We expect more specific details to be reached in our preparatory negotiations.
To the surprise of the international community, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un told South Korean envoys and Chinese President Xi Jinping that he's open to discussing denuclearization. Kang said Seoul will clarify what this may entail during the preparatory steps of the summit, and she added that there will also be discussions with Washington on the process and timeframe over how to dismantle the regime's nuclear program. However, there has also been calls for North Korea's human rights abuses to be tackled at the upcoming summits. Earlier in March, the United Nations Human Rights Council renewed a resolution condemning the regime's human rights situation, which Pyongyang then denounced. Although Seoul's foreign minister said that the issue remains a key concern for South Korea, she was cagey over whether it would be brought up in the upcoming talks.
We have continued to cooperate with the international community on North Korea's poor human rights record and have taken part at the UN to try and improve the situation. South Korea also has its own North Korea Human Rights Act. But on whether we should include this issue at the upcoming summit, for government, I think more preparation is needed.
Kang also said that South Korea is continuing to cooperate with all related nations, such as China and Japan, and confirmed that a trilateral summit between the three sides is being planned for May. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
Now, staying with the ongoing diplomatic efforts to denuclearize North Korea, the foreign ministers of North Korea and Russia are scheduled to hold talks in Moscow next week on the current developments related to the Korean Peninsula. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho is scheduled to sit down with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Moscow next Tuesday. Russia's foreign ministry confirmed Wednesday that Pyongyang's top diplomat will visit Russia from April 9th to the 11th. It explained that Lee and Lavrov are expected to discuss the present and future of their bilateral relations, adding the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula will also be an important agenda item. Lee will be arriving in Russia after attending a ministerial meeting of the non-aligned movement held Thursday through Friday in Azerbaijan and after visiting one of the Commonwealth of Independent States countries. Meanwhile, North Korea's state-run media has disclosed a reply telegram from Chinese President Xi Jinping to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The Korean Central News Agency reports that President Xi sent a message to Kim on March 23rd, which is seen as an answer to the congratulatory telegram Kim sent to Xi earlier after his re-election as president. It also explained that President Xi emphasized the importance of the traditional friendship between the two allies. The recovery of their traditional friendship has been highlighted by both the North and China since Kim's surprise visit to Beijing late last month. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
With their trade spat threatening to spill over into an all-out trade war, U.S. President Donald Trump has attempted to take the back-and-forth rhetoric with China down a notch. He has heaped blame not on the Chinese, but on previous U.S. administrations who, he says, got the U.S. into the problem in the first place. Lee Seung-jae with the details.
U.S. President Donald Trump, who just last month stated that trade wars are good and easy to win, tried to cool economic anxieties over the huge Chinese tariffs imposed on the U.S. He took to Twitter on Wednesday, saying the U.S. is not in a trade war with China, adding that the war was lost many years ago by the foolish or the incompetent people who represented the U.S. President Trump went on to say that the U.S. has a trade deficit with China of $500 billion a year, with intellectual property theft amounting to another $300 billion. He was apparently referring to a deficit of $506 billion in Chinese exports to the U.S. last year, something Trump touched upon during a cabinet meeting a day earlier.
Again, our relationship is very good with China, and we intend to keep it that way. But we have to do something to seriously relieve that trade deficit. We can't have a $500 billion a year trade deficit. We also have the theft of intellectual property, and that probably is in the neighborhood of $200 to $300 billion a year.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said on Wednesday that China's recent tariffs on U.S. exports should not surprise anyone, adding he was a little surprised Wall Street was so surprised. According to Ross, Chinese new tariffs do not represent a threat to the United States, as it amounts to about 0.3% of U.S. GDP. In response to the trade spat, China's Vice Minister of Commerce said that while Beijing is trying to avoid a trade war, they will stand and fight if one starts.
China does not want a trade war because there will be no winner in a trade war. If someone insists on starting a trade war, China will fight till the end. China's stance has been consistent regarding the channels of consultation and communication. The door is always open for negotiation and consultation.
The remarks come as China imposed its own 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of U.S. exports, which will affect 106 products, including aircraft, cars, and soybeans. As the world watches on, fears are growing that the intensifying trade spat between the two economic superpowers will indeed turn into a full-blown trade war. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Facing some 18 corruption charges, former President Park Geun-hye will have her sentencing trial on Friday afternoon. The sentencing, which will be broadcast live, will see Park facing a verdict by the lower court over charges related to bribery, abuse of power, and a string of other charges related to the massive influence peddling case that led to her removal from office last year. In February, prosecutors sought a 30-year prison sentence and a fine of $110 million. Despite the live broadcast set to garner a large number of viewers, Park is unlikely to attend her trial as she's been boycotting court proceedings since last October. The nation's top office is urging lawmakers to swiftly act on revising the National Referendum Act, which was ruled unconstitutional back in 2014. It would be the first step to enabling a public vote on a constitutional amendment. Our chief Cheonghwa-dae correspondent Moon Gon-young tells us more.
Taking last resort, with South Korea's political parties stuck in second gear with no progress in advancing forward the nation's constitutional amendment agenda, the presidential Blue House has taken a last resort, going public with its call on the legislature to at least swiftly revise the National Referendum Act, the first step to enabling a public vote on a constitutional amendment.
As we near the opening of the Parliament's April extraordinary session, I've come forward today to request the National Assembly to swiftly revise the National Referendum Act.
South Korea is seeking to amend the constitution, which was last revised more than 30 years ago, and put the revision bill up for a public vote during the June 13th local elections. However, Seoul's National Assembly has been stuck on the process with the rival parties' lengthy standoff over the proposed constitutional changes, as well as over the law on national referendums. The country's law on national referendum was ruled unconstitutional in 2014 for putting a limit on the voting rights of overseas Koreans, with the court's recommendation for a revision bill. The political parties missed the 2015 deadline to revise the act, leaving the law null and void since 2016, which means even if the political parties do agree and come up with a single constitutional revision bill, the people will not be able to vote on it.
Leaving the national referendum law as unconstitutional is itself an act of challenge to the people's constitutional right and a serious damage to direct democracy guaranteed by our constitution.
Making note of the president's constitutional revision bill submitted to Parliament last month, President Moon's chief of staff reiterated the Blue House stance that it's ready to draw back the bill once the political parties come up with a single bill of their own.
The Parliament's decision to revise the national referendum law will confirm its intent and sincerity on amending the Constitution.
The Blue House's news conference calling on Parliament to first take action on making it constitutional for Koreans to vote on various national issues is seen by many as the South Korean president putting his foot down on carrying out his campaign pledge to put to referendum a constitutional revision bill in tandem with the June 13th local elections. Moon Gon-young, Arirang News, The Blue House.
Korea celebrates its Arbor Day today when a nationwide campaign to plant trees takes place. Our Lee Jung-yeon is here in the studio to tell us more about the day. Good morning, Jung-yeon.
Hi, Mark.
So I believe it's Korea's 73rd Arbor Day, so this is a tradition that stretches back a great many decades.
Yes, Mark. Arbor Day, or Sikmogil as it's called in Korean, actually started as a way to fight deforestation. And while planting trees is still the main idea, in light of recent environmental issues like fine dust, that's a huge concern for the Korean public. It's gone beyond Tree Planting Day to really be a chance for the public and for the government to check in with the environmental issues that need to be dealt with in general.
Yeah, fine dust really is a chronic problem here in Korea now. And while we're speaking of the fine dust levels, are there any special plans by the government on this Arbor Day to try and deal with this problem?
Yes, the government is trying to increase the amount of green spaces in the country, especially in cities where people are affected the most by the fine dust issue. And the Korea Forest Service recently drew up contracts with Seoul and Suwon to expand their city forest reserves to reduce fine dust levels. And according to data released by the agency last May, the average fine dust level in these reserves was around 26% lower than the city center, while the average ultrafine dust level was more than 40% lower. Now, the past few weeks, various organizations and communities have been holding tree planting events nationwide in time for Arbor Day, so I went to take a look at one earlier this week. April 5th marks Arbor Day, or Singmogil, here in Korea. Although the day stopped being a public holiday in 2005, various groups in government offices, schools, and workplaces are still carrying on with the tradition of tree planting every year. More than 100 people have gathered to plant 5,000 pine trees for Arbor Day. Although this practice can still be seen in South Korea, with each year that passes, this site is becoming increasingly harder to come by. Over the past decade, the number of trees planted in Gyeonggi-do province decreased by around 20% to 2.5 million trees last year, while the area decreased by around 16%. However, experts say the decrease isn't necessarily a negative sign.
Korea is considered a pretty successful case of reforestation. It's just less common to plant trees than before because we have less land to fill up.
What's also changed over the years is the types of trees planted. The most popular choice for reforestation purposes has been the pine tree, but that has changed due to various reasons, such as the spread of pests that thrives off pine wood. Instead, another type of evergreen tree, the nakyeopsong tree, and broadleaf trees such as tulip trees are planted more often these days. The Korea Forest Service has said that in the few months before and after Arbor Day, they plan to plant around 54 million trees over 22,000 hectares of land across the nation. An official from the organization said that ultimately by 2022, the agency aims to expand the proportion of nature per square meter in major cities from around 10 square meters as it is now to around 12 square meters in order to minimize the negative impact of fine dust pollution. So as mentioned earlier, tree planting may not be as commonplace as it was maybe 20 years ago, but because of glaringly obvious issues like fine dust, the government is continuously making efforts to expand green reserves here in Korea.
Well, that's an idea I think all of us in Korea can get behind, and let's hope it happens, if for nothing else, for the sake of our lungs. Well, thank you very much, Jung-yeon, for the report, and happy Arbor Day to you. Now, from tree planting, we're going to turn to our international stories from around the world. And we start with the poisoning of a Russian ex-spy. Quite the jump. As Western nations continue to point the finger at Russia, Moscow has called for an open meeting of the UN Security Council on Thursday, local time, to discuss the matter. For more on this and other news from around the world, let's turn to our Noah Adam. So, Adam, Russia is pushing extremely hard to prove it was not involved in this nerve agent attack in Salisbury.
That's right, Mark. Russia's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, called for the meeting after a speech on Wednesday to a council meeting on chemical weapons, on the chemical weapons situation in Syria. He reportedly wrote to the UNSC president saying Russia shares the principle that the use of chemical weapons anywhere is not acceptable and must be investigated. Russia has been pressured to admit being involved in the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter last month, but Moscow has denied the widespread allegations sparked by Britain. The British research lab Porton Down on Tuesday said the nerve agent used was military-grade Novichok, but added that it cannot prove if it is of Russian origin. Meanwhile, during a meeting of the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog at The Hague on Wednesday, Russia's proposal to be part of the investigation into the attack was voted down by 15 votes to 6 with 17 abstentions. Despite the rejection, Russia's envoy to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons said the number of countries that abstained from the vote showed widespread uneasiness with Britain. A series of mishaps by the UK has given Russia a diplomatic advantage, and Moscow is jumping on that opportunity by calling a series of global meetings to make its case. British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson claimed in a recent interview that Porton Down told him that Russia was to blame for the Salisbury attack. The UK's Foreign Office also admitted to deleting a tweet which made similar claims. This has raised questions on whether Britain may have overstated its case in accusing Russia. Washington is set to deploy the National Guard along the U.S. Mexican border, and President Donald Trump has signed the proclamation to put the order into effect. Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen said a briefing Wednesday that the deployment is intended to fight drug smuggling and illegal immigration. The decision comes just a day after President Trump said that he aims to use the military to secure the country's southern border until a, quote, big beautiful wall is erected. Former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama have sent about 6,000 and 1,200 National Guard troops to the U.S. Mexico border in 2006 and 2010, respectively, to beef up security efforts. Facebook's data leak scandal is turning out to be much larger than initially thought. The social network giant is now saying that data from 87 million users may have been improperly shared with Cambridge Analytica, a British consultancy firm accused of trying to influence elections for Donald Trump. The figure is up from a previous news media estimate of more than 50 million. Facebook announced the revised number in a blog post on Wednesday, adding that it will restrict the data it allows outsiders to access on its users. The revelation comes as Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is set to testify in Congress next Wednesday over the issue.
Good morning. I hope you've been enjoying the beautiful spring flowers around you. And as we all know, cherry blossoms usually bloom after Forsythias, but unseasonably warm temperatures have sped up the cherry blossoms to bloom earlier. So we've been enjoying two beautiful spring flowers at the same time. But some more cherry blossoms could fall to the ground with winds and rain today in most parts of South Korea, while Japan and Beijing will be under cloudy to partly sunny skies. So rain has been falling since early in the morning and is expected to spread to more parts of the country. And this band of showers will linger until early Friday morning. And it's much cooler outside with highs hovering in the lower teens in most parts on this Arbor Day here in South Korea, getting up to 10 degrees Celsius here in Seoul and Gyeongju, and Chuncheon will only make it to 9 degrees. With that, let's take a look at the international weather for viewers around the world. So most of South Korea will notice much cooler temperatures due to the rain. Many regions in North Korea will have rain or sleet. And as for the rest of Asia, Beijing is going through some wide temperature fluctuations from the upper 20s to lower teens. Meanwhile, Australia will be under mostly sunny skies this Thursday. And heading to North America, a wind warning is in place in Montreal, and readings will remain in the negative territory all day on Thursday. And as for South America, major cities will have a repeat of Wednesday's weather conditions. Taking you to Europe, it's going to rain on Thursday in Stockholm, while a mix of rain and snow is in the forecast for Friday. Lastly, to Africa, Addis Ababa will have rain along with scattered thunderstorms. And that's all the weather update for now.
Well, that's all the news we have for now. Our next bulletin is coming up at noon Korea time in around 90 minutes from now. So until then, goodbye.
우리 민족들이 힘을 합쳐 통일을 이룩합시다.
South and North Korea are stronger when we are together. The historic moments and the wave of peace created by one Korea stunned the world. The melody of hope sung together and the energetic reconciliation brought the spring of peace to the Korean peninsula. We are one Korea.